Welcome back. Let's spend a few minutes thinking about the idea of production and a production function. So that's just how does a firm take its inputs and turn it into output. And then let's think about the costs that go with that production. So to get us started, I've started setting up a table of inputs and outputs, and we can fill in the associated costs with it. So imagine that we've got a firm and they're making units of output, and really their only input is just labor. So let's take the first case, right? If we have 0 workers, that means the firm's going to produce 0 output. But even if the firm isn't producing output, it still has some fixed costs. So think of this as rent, right? They've rented a building. Even if they're not using it, they still have to pay rent on it. And then as they hire workers and ramp up, there'll be a labor cost involved, and we can find the total cost. So let's sort of work through this and think it through. So where do we want to start? Let's first start with this idea of the marginal product of labor. So how much additional output is produced by each worker? So if the firm has 0 workers, there's 0 output, right? This is just a wash. We can't define it. But what happens when they hire 1 worker? So they go from being closed, no production, to having 1 worker, and their output is now 50 units. Right? So that marginal production, that first worker increased output by 50 units. And then they hire a second worker. So now with 2 workers, the firm can produce a total of 90 units. So how much additional output is created by this second worker? So we went from 50 units of output to 90 units of output. That means the marginal product of labor, the second worker, right, is 40 units. I say, oh great, well we hire more people, we produce more, let's hire a third person. So they hire a third person. Now all 3 of those workers are producing 120 units. So how much did this third worker add? They added an additional 30 units of output. You see where these numbers are coming from? Where does this 40 come from? It's just 90 minus the 50 of the previous worker. Where does this additional 30 units come from? Well, it's the total that we're making now, 120 with 3 workers, minus how much was produced with 2 workers. So let's finish filling this out. When they hire the 4th worker, now this 4th worker contributes an additional 20 units, a 5th worker contributes an additional 10 units, and a 6th worker contributes an additional 5 units. Now if you're looking at that and you're like, seems like there's a pattern here. You're absolutely right. So these numbers are diminishing, right? Each worker adds less than the prior worker did. So this is diminishing marginal product. So that means each unit of input, in this case workers, each additional unit of input, each additional worker leads to additional production but less than before. Matter of fact, if you carry this on, you could imagine a scenario where maybe this even goes negative. So if you're thinking about adding cooks to a kitchen at a restaurant, well at some point you're going to hire an additional cook, and not only are they not helpful, but they just get in everybody's way and slow down output. So these contributions, this marginal product of labor diminishes, and you could imagine it even going negative. So we're telling the story here using workers, but you could think of the same story using equipment, etc. So if you own a coffee shop, the first espresso machine you have is really, really valuable, right? But if you buy a second one, it probably doesn't help as much as the first one. You buy a third one, doesn't help as much as the second one. That's the same idea, except instead of being diminishing marginal product of labor, it would be diminishing marginal product of capital in that case. All right, so we filled in our column for the marginal product of labor. Let's look at the cost of labor. So suppose labor costs $10 an hour. It's just choosing a number that makes the math easy. All right, so $10 an hour, if we have no workers, that means the labor costs are 0. If we have 1 worker, now the labor costs are $10. If we have 2 workers, labor costs are $20, 3, $30, 4, $40, 5, $50, and 6 is $60. So is $10 a realistic wage? Probably not in almost any industry, but it makes the math easy, so we're going to use it. All right, so we've thought about number of workers. The company is sort of building out their spreadsheet and their projections using different numbers of workers. They have an idea how much output can be produced with those different numbers of workers. They know their rent is $30. We've now added this marginal product of labor, right? So we calculated that through, and we've added in our numbers for what's our labor cost. So we're now to the point where we can think about what's the firm's total cost. So what is total cost? Well, it's just the sum of the fixed costs, in this case rent, plus the variable costs. Well, what are variable costs? These are costs that change with the amount of output. They vary with output. In our story here, that's just the labor cost. All right, so what are these total costs then? Well, it's rent of $30 plus labor. So if the firm has 0 workers, their total cost is the $30 of rent plus $0 in labor, or $30. When they hire the first worker, they've still got to pay rent of $30, plus now they have this $10 of variable cost, or in our example, labor cost. So now what's their total cost? It's $40. What if they're hiring 2 workers? Well, still have rent of $30 plus labor cost for 2 workers of $20 means now their total cost is $50. And we can just work our way down, right? So with 3 workers, it's $60. With 4 workers, it's $70. With 5 workers, it's $80. And with 6 workers, it's $90. So we've now built out our table to think about this marginal product of labor. We've thought about the labor costs, and now we've gotten to the total cost. So what does this look like if we start to look at it in a graphical form? So we want to look at 2 things. We want to look at production, right? So we want to graph out their production function, if you will, and we want to look at total cost. So let's look at production first. So if we make a graph of production, what do we want to think about? We want to think about output versus the number of workers, right? So we want to think about output, how many units they produce, versus their inputs, in this case, workers. So let's just plot in the data from our table. So if we start out at 0 workers, we get 0 output. What about if there's 1 worker? So 1 worker led the output of 50 units. So that first worker increased output the 50 units. Then they hire a second worker, and output increases to 90 units. So we've got a second worker, and output not quite doubles, right, up to 90 units. So we can plot in our point for that. They hire a third worker, and now are producing 120 units. So a third worker and 120 units. What about a fourth worker? We won't put them all in. A fourth worker increases production to 140 units. So 140 units. So I think you can probably see a pattern. No, this isn't scaled perfectly, obviously, but that first worker gets us 50 additional units. The next one gets us 40. The next one gets us 30 additional units. The next one gets us 20 additional units. Each additional worker increases output, but by less than the prior one. So what does this production function look like, or this curve look like? It's flattening off, right? It's flattening off. That's this idea of diminishing marginal product. The more workers we have, the less additional output we get. So this thing flattens off as it goes. All right, so that's looking at production. This is sometimes referred to as a production function, right? What is this thing? This is the production function. So it just shows us how a firm turns inputs, workers, in the output production, right? So workers versus production. That's our production function. What happens to costs as firms increase their output? So let's look at that as well. So if we want to look at costs, let's look at total cost. All right, so total cost. And now what we want to look at is what's happening to costs as output increases, right? So their quantity of output. So what were their costs? At zero quantity, they still had a fixed cost, right, of $30 in rent. So at zero quantity, their total cost was $30. So 0 units, they've got to pay $30. When they increase to produce a little bit more, right? So they expand output, they hire a worker. Now their output jumps to 50 units. So their output jumps to 50 units. What happens to their costs? So it's one worker that's producing 50 units. So they've got this $30 in rent plus $10 in labor, means their costs have increased to $40. So their costs increase a little bit to $40. So that's, we'll put it somewhere like there. All right, what if they expand a little bit more? They hire a second worker, they expand output to 90 units. All right, so now 90 units. What happens to their costs? So their costs go from $40 up to $50. So now $50 for 90 units. They hire an additional worker, expand to 120 units of output, and their costs go to $60. So $60 and 120 units of output. So what's happening here? What's our pattern? Let's do one more and see if it becomes clear to us. What if they expand beyond 120 units? What if they hire this fourth worker, they expand to 140 units? Okay, so they got another worker, but they're only getting a little bit more. And if you're like, man, his numbers are right on top of each other, you're seeing the point here, right? Yes, their costs keep stair-stepping up for each additional worker, but the amount of additional output doesn't increase by as much. So now there's something like, what was it, $70 at 4 workers for 140 units. So what's happening to their costs? Their costs are increasing exponentially. All right, this is total cost. So those costs are increasing exponentially. Well, why are they increasing like that? Why do they just sort of take off? Well, because each additional worker who we're paying provides less and less output. So as that marginal product of labor flattens off, that means total costs are increasing. To get that next unit of output becomes more and more and more expensive, right? Becomes more expensive, and then more expensive, and then even more expensive. And you see this total cost curve take off almost exponentially. All right, so what are our notes that we should take away from this? Right, so our note is that diminishing marginal product of labor in this case is going to lead to increasing marginal costs. Each additional unit is going to be more expensive than the prior one. So what does that mean? That means that our total cost, right, our total cost increases at an increasing rate. At an increasing rate. What does this mean in plain terms or plain English? It means it becomes steeper. So you could easily do this with calculus, right? The slope of the curve is the first derivative and the change is the second derivative. We don't want to do that. We just want to take the intuition away from this. That if we've got each additional worker contributing less than the prior worker contributed, that means that these total costs are going to take off because we have increasing marginal costs. Each additional worker paid $10 provides less than the prior one, so we get this increasing total cost function. I think this is probably a good spot for us to pause. I know this is a lot, for sure. Go back through it, draw notes, think about it, and I think you'll be able to sort of put together the table and then the relationship between production and total cost. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.